Claire Johnson sat in her plush first-class seat, her perfectly manicured fingers gliding over the screen of her designer smartphone. The dim lighting of the cabin cast a warm glow on her perfectly styled hair, and her attire, a tailored blazer adorned with an extravagant brooch, made it clear she belonged to a world of privilege. As she scrolled through her social media feeds, her expression remained one of indifference and superiority. The passengers boarding the plane in economy class caught her eye, but she quickly dismissed them, focusing instead on her meticulously curated online presence. "Can you believe these people?" she muttered to her seatmate, a middle-aged man with a kind face who was engrossed in a novel. "They think they can just waltz in here like they belong in our world." Her voice dripped with disdain as she gestured toward the economy section, where a mother struggled to manage her fussy toddler while juggling a suitcase. Her seatmate glanced up, discomfort evident in his eyes, but he chose to remain silent, not wanting to engage with her blatant prejudice. Claire continued, oblivious to the growing tension. "I just don't understand how they think they deserve the same treatment we do. It's laughable." She chuckled, a self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. As the boarding continued, Agent Marcus Turner stepped on the plane, his demeanor calm and assured. Dressed in a sharp navy suit that fit him impeccably, he exuded an air of confidence that contrasted starkly with Claire's haughty attitude. As he made his way down the aisle, Claire's gaze fell upon him, and an expression of disdain crossed her face. "Look at that," she whispered mockingly to her seatmate, her voice barely audible yet laced with venom. "What's he doing up here? I didn't realize they were letting just anyone in first class these days." She rolled her eyes, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I guess they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel now." Marcus, who was well aware of the eyes upon him, chose to ignore her. He took his seat, pulling out a file from his briefcase, intending to prepare for the meeting that awaited him upon landing. He was accustomed to judgment based on appearances. It was part of his reality as a black man in a predominantly white profession. Yet he remained composed, focusing on the task at hand. As the flight attendants began their pre-flight checks, Claire's arrogance escalated. She waved her hand dismissively, calling one of them over with a flick of her wrist. "Excuse me," she said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Can you explain why someone like him is allowed in first class? I thought this was a premium experience, not a charity case." The flight attendant, a young woman with a warm smile, paused, her expression shifting to one of concern. "Ma'am, everyone in this cabin has a valid ticket," she replied, her tone professional. "We don't discriminate based on appearance." "Of course you wouldn't," Claire shot back, her eyes narrowing. "But surely you can see how ridiculous it is. First class is for those who actually matter." She glanced around the cabin, seeking validation from other passengers, but found only uncomfortable silence. The tension in the air thickened as Marcus kept his eyes on his file, determined not to engage. "People like him," Claire continued, her voice rising slightly, "should really know their place." She leaned closer to her seatmate, who was now visibly squirming in his seat. "What's next? A homeless person in first class?" Marcus kept his composure, feeling the weight of her words but choosing silence over confrontation. He could sense the whispers and glances directed his way, but he remained focused on the file, aware that the flight was about to take off. The engines roared to life, and the plane began to taxi down the runway, but Claire's words lingered in the cabin, a reminder of the prejudice that often lurked beneath the surface of society. As the plane lifted off, Claire's disdain echoed in the confines of first class, setting the stage for an encounter that would challenge her notions of privilege and superiority. The atmosphere was charged, and unbeknownst to her, the flight was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would force her to confront the very biases she so freely expressed. As the flight continued its ascent into the clear blue sky, Claire Johnson leaned back in her plush seat, a smirk playing on her lips as she continued her tirade against Marcus Turner. She felt a thrill from her own audacity, reveling in the attention she garnered. "Look at him," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, loud enough for those seated nearby to hear. "What does he think he's doing up here in first class? I guess they let anyone in these days. Marcus sat 2 rows ahead, his brow furrowing slightly as he tried to tune out Claire's incessant remarks. He could feel the weight of her disdain, but chose to remain focused on his laptop, typing away as he reviewed case files. He understood that engaging with her would only escalate the situation, so he maintained his composure and dignity, reminding himself of the importance of professionalism, even in the face of ignorance. Claire's voice rose another notch, gaining momentum. "Isn't it funny?" she continued, gesturing theatrically. "I mean, I can't even remember the last time I saw someone like him up here. What's next? Do we let the flight attendants serve drinks in flip-flops?" The laughter that followed her comment sent a ripple through the cabin, and some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting disapproving glances at Claire. "Ma'am, could you please keep your voice down?" a stewardess gently interjected, her tone firm yet polite. "We don't want to disturb the other passengers." Claire waved her hand dismissively, her eyes narrowing at the stewardess. "Oh, come on, let's be real here. How many agents have you seen that look like him? I mean, do they even know how to dress for the occasion?" A woman seated across the aisle leaned in closer to her companion, whispering, "This is ridiculous. She should be ashamed of herself." The murmurs of disapproval began to rise around Claire, but she remained oblivious, lost in her own self-righteousness. "I just don't understand how someone like him," she continued, her voice dripping with disdain, "could ever be qualified for a job that requires intelligence and skill. I mean, look at him." Finally, Marcus turned slightly in his seat, his patience wearing thin. He could hear the rising tension in the cabin, could sense the weight of the judgment in the air, and he felt a surge of anger rise within him. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of the dignity he had cultivated through years of hard work and dedication. "Excuse me," he said, turning to face Claire, his voice steady but firm. "I'd appreciate it if you could keep your comments to yourself. Not everyone shares your narrow view of the world." Claire's eyes widened in surprise, her previous confidence momentarily shaken. "Oh, so you can speak," she retorted, her tone mocking. "I thought you were just a pretty face in a suit." The tension in the cabin escalated, and a few passengers exchanged glances filled with concern. A young man in a business suit sitting behind Claire leaned forward, his voice low but clear. "You really should stop. It's embarrassing." Claire's cheeks flushed, but she pressed on, her arrogance fueling her defenses. "I'm just calling it how I see it. This is a first-class cabin, and frankly, I don't believe he belongs here." Marcus clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. "My presence here is not up for debate," he replied, his tone clipped. "I've earned my place just like everyone else on this flight." Claire leaned forward, her eyes glinting with defiance. "Then justify it. What makes you so special?" As the tension peaked, the plane hit a sudden patch of turbulence, causing the passengers to gasp and the flight attendants to rush down the aisles to secure the cabin. Claire's bravado faltered as she clutched the armrests, her earlier arrogance melting away into a growing sense of fear. Marcus, however, remained calm, his focus shifting to the safety of those around him. He stood, moving to reassure a mother who was visibly shaken, his composed demeanor contrasting sharply with Claire's panicked expression. "Ma'am, it's going to be all right," he said, his voice soothing as he knelt beside her. "Just hold on tight and keep your eyes on your little one." Claire watched, her heart pounding as Marcus took control of the situation with grace. In that moment, something shifted within her. The realization of her own pettiness began to seep in, but her pride refused to let it fully surface. As Marcus Turner opened his mouth to finally respond to Claire's incessant taunts, the airplane suddenly jolted. A powerful turbulence shook the cabin, causing overhead compartments to rattle ominously. The flight attendants, who had been moving comfortably through the first class, swiftly secured their carts and called for passengers to buckle their seatbelts. Claire's bravado evaporated in an instant. Her face paled, and her grip on the armrest tightened. She glanced nervously around the cabin, her previous confidence replaced with a flicker of fear. The laughter that had filled the air moments ago was replaced by anxious murmurs and worried glances. "Everyone, please remain calm and stay seated. one of the flight attendants announced, her voice steady but firm. "We're experiencing some turbulence, but it will pass shortly." Marcus, who had instinctively reached for the seatbelt, looked around the cabin with an air of calmness that contrasted sharply with Claire's growing panic. He turned slightly in his seat to reassure the young girl seated beside him, whose wide eyes mirrored Claire's anxiety. "It's okay," he said softly. "Just a little bump in the road. We'll be fine." The little girl, perhaps no older than 8, nodded but looked unconvinced. Marcus leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "You know, sometimes the clouds just get a bit grumpy. They shake the plane to let us know they're there, but they never really hurt us. Just hold on tight and breathe." Claire watched as Marcus, the man she had derided moments before, transformed into a source of comfort. The little girl squeezed his hand, her fear visibly dissipating as she focused on his calming demeanor. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As the turbulence began to subside, Claire felt a strange sensation of humility wash over her. Here was Marcus, a black man whom she had publicly humiliated, now taking it upon himself to comfort a child. She felt her own fears about the turbulence merging with a growing sense of shame. "Is it over?" the girl asked, her eyes darting to the windows as if searching for the cloud's discontent. "Almost," Marcus said, looking out himself. "Just a bit longer. You're doing great." Claire shifted uncomfortably in her seat, replaying her earlier insults in her mind. Each word seemed to echo louder now, taunting her with its arrogance. She cast a sidelong glance at Marcus, who remained composed, his focus on the young girl. The turbulence finally ceased, and the cabin settled into a tense stillness. Passengers began to breathe easier, but Claire felt an unfamiliar weight settle in her chest. She turned to her seatmate, a middle-aged man who had been quietly observing the entire exchange. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice quivering slightly. "He was calm," he interrupted, his tone firm yet measured. "He was calm, even when you were being less than civil." Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she looked back at Marcus, who had now returned his attention to the girl. The flight attendants resumed their duties, and the atmosphere began to shift once more. But Claire remained in her seat, frozen in contemplation. "Why did I—" she started, but her words trailed off as she realized she had no ready answer. The little girl, now visibly relaxed, smiled up at Marcus. "You're like a superhero," she declared, her innocence illuminating the cabin. "You make people feel safe." Marcus chuckled lightly, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I'm just doing my job, but thank you. It's nice to hear that." Claire's heart sank deeper. She longed for that kind of respect, that kind of acknowledgement. She had spent her life demanding it from others, never stopping to consider how she might earn it instead. Her thoughts raced as she considered the implications of her actions. "What's your name?" the girl asked, looking up at Marcus with wide, trusting eyes. "Marcus," he replied. "And what's yours?" "Emily," she beamed, the fear of earlier moments completely forgotten. As the plane leveled out, Claire felt her defenses crumbling. The turbulence had unsettled her physically, yes, but it had also shaken her emotionally. She realized she had been living in a bubble of privilege, insulated from the very realities that defined others' lives. Watching Marcus interact with Emily, she made a silent vow to herself. Maybe it was time for a change, a time to reassess her actions and attitudes. The facade of superiority that had once felt so solid was now nothing more than a flimsy cover for the insecurities she had buried deep within. The flight attendants moved down the aisle again, checking on passengers. Claire's heart raced as she contemplated the man sitting just a few feet away from her, a man she had unjustly judged. It was in that moment, surrounded by the remnants of her arrogance and the warmth of unexpected camaraderie, that she began to understand. Humility was the first step toward redemption. As the turbulence settled and the buzzing of anxious murmurs filled the cabin, the captain's voice broke through the noise, smooth and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience during that brief period of turbulence. I would also like to take this moment to introduce a special guest on board. Please welcome Agent Marcus Turner, a federal officer with the FBI. Claire Johnson, who had been regaining her composure with a haughty tilt of her chin, froze. The realization hit her like a cold wave. The man she had ridiculed, the one she had deemed unworthy of first class, was not just an ordinary passenger. He was a respected agent of the law. Her heart raced as she glanced around the cabin, noticing the shift in atmosphere. Passengers who had previously averted their gazes from her now looked at her with a mix of disbelief and concern. Marcus, maintaining his calm demeanor, offered a polite nod to the passengers, his professionalism radiating confidence. He was well aware of the whispers that began to rise like a tide, carrying with them the weight of Claire's disparaging remarks. Yet he remained composed, a testament to his character, forged through years of facing prejudice and unwarranted scrutiny. Claire's face paled as the implications of her behavior sunk in. She could feel the stares piercing through her, the judgment evident in the way some passengers exchanged glances. "Oh, God," she whispered under her breath, the reality of her arrogance crashing down upon her like a ton of bricks. "What have I done?" In the row behind her, a woman leaned forward, her expression a mixture of pity and disappointment. "You really should apologize," she said softly, the gentleness of her tone only amplifying Claire's guilt. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Claire, for the first time, felt the crushing weight of her entitlement. I didn't know," she stammered, though deep down she understood that ignorance was no excuse. The insidious nature of her prejudice swirled in her mind, and she couldn't help but wish for the ground to swallow her whole. Across the aisle, a man shook his head in disbelief. "I can't believe you treated him like that. He's not just anyone. He's an agent. You should be ashamed." His voice was low but carried an unmistakable edge of anger, resonating with others who nodded in agreement. Claire's heart raced, and she glanced at Marcus, who was now speaking with a flight attendant, his demeanor unruffled. He exuded an air of dignity that only made her feel smaller. How could she have been so blind? How could she have thought herself superior to someone who devoted his life to serving and protecting others? She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of tears prickling her eyes. Just moments before, she had wielded her privilege like a weapon, and now it felt like a curse. The thought of confronting Marcus terrified her, but the weight of her actions demanded accountability. As the flight continued, the murmur of conversations surrounded her, the passengers' whispers a constant reminder of her shame. She could hear snippets of their conversations, each word like a splinter digging deeper into her conscience. "Did you see how she treated him?" one passenger remarked. "Unbelievable," another agreed. Claire's heart sank further with each comment. She realized that this moment would not be easily forgotten, neither by her nor by those who witnessed her prejudice. Finally, as they began their descent, Claire summoned every ounce of courage she could muster. If she didn't speak to Marcus, she knew she would regret it for the rest of her life. The thought of living with that shame felt unbearable. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she stood up, determination etched onto her face. As she approached him, she could see Marcus engaged in a conversation with a few passengers, his presence commanding, yet approachable. "Agent Turner?" she said, her voice steadier now, though laced with apprehension. His head turned, and for a moment their eyes met. In his gaze, she saw a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Yes," he replied, the calmness in his voice a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling within her. Claire took a deep breath, the weight of her arrogance pressing down on her. "I need to speak with you, if you have a moment." The quiet tension between them hung in the air, the unspoken acknowledgement of her past behavior lingering like a dark cloud. Marcus nodded slightly, his expression unreadable, as Claire felt the eyes of her fellow passengers upon her, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, a palpable shift enveloped the cabin. The once lively chatter of the passengers had morphed into subdued whispers, all eyes darting toward Claire Johnson, whose face was a mask of confusion and embarrassment. She could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. Just moments ago, she had been the queen of first class, but now she was just another passenger, stripped of her arrogance and privilege. "Did you really think you could talk to him like that?" a voice from behind her murmured, dripping with disdain. Claire turned slightly, catching the eye of a woman she didn't recognize. The woman's expression was one of disbelief, and Claire felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She sighed, her heart racing as the reality of her actions settled in. Marcus Turner stood near the front of the cabin, calmly gathering his belongings. He exuded an air of confidence and grace, his posture relaxed despite the earlier tension. The other passengers began to disembark, and Claire watched as a fellow agent approached him, their interaction further heightening her anxiety. "Agent Turner!" the man called out, his voice booming with familiarity. "I didn't expect to see you here on a commercial flight. What's the story?" Marcus turned, a small smile breaking across his face. "Just a routine mission. Nothing too exciting," he replied, his tone warm yet professional. The agent nodded appreciatively, but Claire caught snippets of their conversation that made her stomach churn. Words like covert, operation, and high stakes floated through the air, amplifying the reality that Marcus was far more significant than she had ever imagined. As the passengers filed past, Claire's heart raced. She felt an overwhelming urge to at least offer an explanation, perhaps even an apology. But how could she after everything she had said? The thought of facing Marcus, of confronting the man she had so publicly humiliated, made her stomach twist in knots. "Claire!" Another voice interrupted her thoughts. It was a young woman, a stranger, but one who had witnessed the entire scene unfold. "I've seen you at those charity galas. I can't believe you would treat someone like that. What were you thinking?" Claire's breath hitched in her throat. I didn't know who he was," she stammered, but even to her own ears the excuse sounded hollow. "That's not an excuse," the woman shot back, her tone sharp. "You judged him based on his appearance. Don't you think that's a little hypocritical coming from someone like you?" As the woman turned away, Claire was left standing in the aisle, the weight of her actions crashing down on her like a wave. She glanced back at Marcus, who was now engaged in a serious discussion with his fellow agent. He was everything she had dismissed him as not being: composed, respected, and utterly unbothered by her previous insults. Summoning her courage, Claire stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Agent Turner," she called out, her voice shaky. The two men paused, turning their attention to her. "Miss Johnson," Marcus greeted her, his expression neutral yet guarded. I owe you an apology," she began, her voice faltering. "I was wrong to speak to you like that. I didn't know who you were, but that's no excuse for my behavior." Marcus regarded her silently for a moment, and Claire felt as if he were looking right through her, assessing the sincerity of her words. "Apologizing is a good first step, Claire," he finally said, his tone calm yet firm. "But you need to understand that words have consequences. You can't just dismiss people based on superficial judgments." His words pierced through her like a knife. She had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of her interactions. And yet, here was Marcus, a man she had tried to belittle, standing tall and unwavering. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the bustle of the terminal. "I truly do. I'll do better, I promise." Marcus nodded, his expression softening slightly. That's all anyone can do: acknowledge their mistakes and strive for growth. It's a process. As he turned to leave, Claire felt a mix of relief and regret. She had taken the first step toward redemption, but the journey ahead would be long and challenging. The whispers of the passengers echoed in her mind, but for the first time, she felt the stirrings of humility, the realization that perhaps there was more to learn than she had ever considered. As Claire stepped into the bustling airport terminal, the atmosphere felt electric with post-flight chatter and the scent of freshly brewed coffee. The weight of her recent humiliation clung to her like a heavy coat, and she instinctively avoided eye contact with those around her. But it was impossible to ignore the whispers that followed her, a mix of disbelief and disapproval that seemed to echo her own shame. Suddenly, she spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Jessica, an old college friend, waved enthusiastically, her bright smile contrasting sharply with Claire's internal turmoil. As Jessica approached, Claire felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Claire, I can't believe I saw you on that flight," Jessica exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "What happened up there? I saw you talking to that agent. It looked intense." Claire's cheeks flushed as she recalled her own words, sharp and cutting, aimed at a man she had wronged without knowing his true worth. "It was a misunderstanding," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "I didn't know he was an FBI agent. I let my biases get the better of me." Jessica's smile faded as she scrutinized Claire's expression. "You've always been a bit arrogant, Claire, but I thought you were better than that. What were you thinking?" Her tone was not accusatory, but rather filled with concern. You can't just treat people that way, especially when you don't know their story. The truth in Jessica's words stung. Claire could feel the heat rising in her chest, a mix of anger and embarrassment. I know. I was awful. I thought I was above it all." The admission felt like a weight lifting, even if only slightly. "I've been so focused on my own little world that I didn't stop to think about how my words could hurt someone else." "I think it's time for you to take a hard look in the mirror," Jessica said gently, placing her hand on Claire's arm. "You're not the person you used to be. You need to make this right." As Claire stood there, grappling with her friend's words, she felt a sudden surge of determination. She had to find Marcus and apologize. It wasn't just a matter of pride, it was about acknowledging the hurt she had caused. Taking a deep breath, she nodded to Jessica. "You're right. I need to face him." Claire threaded her way through the terminal, her heart pounding with each step. She spotted Marcus standing near a group of passengers, engaged in conversation, his demeanor calm and approachable. He seemed like a pillar of strength, and the contrast to her own turmoil was stark. Gathering her courage, Claire approached him, her heart racing. "Agent Turner," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He turned to face her, his expression neutral, but his eyes betraying a flicker of recognition. "I wanted to speak with you. I owe you an apology." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his posture relaxed yet cautious. "Yes, you do," he replied, his tone even. "What you said on the plane was unacceptable." "I know," Claire replied, her voice softer now. "I was wrong. I let my prejudice cloud my judgment, and I treated you terribly without knowing who you really are. I'm truly sorry." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken understanding. Then Marcus sighed, a mix of resignation and empathy washing over his features. "Apologies are important, Claire, but they have to come with change. I've faced my share of prejudice, so I understand how damaging it can be. It's not just about you, it's about how we all treat one another." Claire nodded vigorously, the sincerity in his voice resonating deeply. "I want to learn from this. I want to be better. I can't change the past, but I can change how I act moving forward." As they stood there, a new layer of understanding began to unfold between them. "We all have biases, Claire," Marcus said, his voice gentler now. "It's about recognizing them and being willing to confront them. I've been judged based on my appearance for years, and it's tiring, but I believe in growth, and I see potential in you." Claire felt a warmth bloom in her chest as Marcus's words sank in. "Thank you for being willing to listen. I want to learn from you, if you'll let me." Marcus smiled, a genuine expression that softened his features. "Let's start with a conversation. We can share our experiences, and who knows, maybe we can help each other grow." In that moment, two worlds collided, one of privilege and arrogance, the other of resilience and understanding. What had begun as a flight filled with prejudice had morphed into a chance for redemption. As Claire and Marcus began to talk, a bridge formed between them, paving the way for a friendship that neither had anticipated but both desperately needed.